Welcome back, everybody, to the second video in this series covering some of the many subfields within psychology. As a reminder, psychology is just the study of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings, and it is really one of the more complicated things that you can study, and that's just because us as human beings are really complicated. In the last video, I outlined some of the more biological fields within psychology, taking a look at some of our evolutionary roots, what's going on in our brain and our neurochemistry, and also touched on some of the cognition and some of the thoughts that we have that drive our behaviors. Today, we're shifting towards a more humanistic side of psychology. These are the parts of psychology that are closer to the actual behaviors that we see out in the real world. So today we're talking about developmental psychology, social psychology, personality psychology, educational psychology, and health psychology. I've put these together because they all explain at least a part of why we act the way we do when we're around other people. Our development and, to a lesser extent, our education go a long way in shaping our personalities. And then our social psychology shows how we interact with others, and that's including our own personalities and other factors that lead to how we act in the world. As a reminder, I'm not intending for these videos to give you a complete, comprehensive understanding of any of these topics. Really, I'm just introducing them to you, and throughout the course of the semester, we'll cover various topics and domains that will hit at each of these concepts and use each of these disciplines to explain it. Without further ado, let's get into developmental psychology. It studies both how and why we change, all the way from prenatal and infancy up until old age and through death. Now, this field is vast. It covers cognitive factors, social factors, physical factors, emotional development, and it explores how all of these aspects of development are influenced by both our nature, which you can think of as our genetics, and our nurture, the environment that we grow up in and that we developed in. So why is developmental psychology important? Well, I would say that understanding both the typical and atypical patterns of growth as people develop allows not just psychologists, but educators, parents, and really anyone to be able to better contextualize and understand how people are the way they are. It allows for better support of children when they are developing and understanding what things are needed for them. For adults who have any sort of issue, and that's pretty much all of us, it's a way of understanding what got us to the place we're at. It also helps us understand the challenges. I think developmental psychology can go a long way in helping people empathize and understand the challenges that people face at different stages of life, because the problems of a child are different from the problems of an adolescent, which are different from the problems of an adult, which are different to the problems of someone in geriatric care. But they're all relevant and they're all important. So let's go into some of the historical backgrounds of this field. To understand how humans grow and change over time, developmental psychology breaks down development into various phases of life. Each of these periods represent a time in which different milestones are achieved, and lots of the early theories hit at this idea. One of the main theories was developed by Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Piaget theorized that children go through 4 distinct phases of cognitive development, with each one characterized by different ways of thinking and understanding the world. The first stage of development that Piaget described was what we call the sensory motor stage, and that lasts from birth to around 2 years old. In this stage, infants are learning to explore the world through cause and effect. They have senses, just like any human being does: taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing. And through those senses, they're able to understand things in the world. And in response to those senses, their motor control will develop. If you remember from the previous video, a large part of the way our body works is just input from the world and output from our motor control. You touch something hot, your hand knows to jerk away. This basic cause and effect learning that infants go through helps them start to develop an understanding of what things they can and can't do. Studies of infants have shown that at early stages of life, and we're talking the very beginning here, infants lack the ability to maintain representations of things that they've seen. So, what does that mean? Well, that's a term that we call object permanence. And it's the idea that you can see something, it goes away, and you still know that it's there. It's why the game of peekaboo is so entertaining to infants. They see your face, but once you cover it up, they don't know that you're there anymore. It takes you opening up for them to get a reaction and see, oh, look, they're still there. They smile, they get happy, they enjoy it. But once you've covered up, you're no longer visible. Your face is gone to them, and they don't have enough cognitive ability to maintain that image. This sensory motor stage is where that ability is developed. I've heard before in pop culture that really smart dogs are about a 2-year-old's level of intelligence. And I can kind of see that in my dog sometimes. If we're playing with a toy and I hide it, like in my shirt or something, or I put it under my chair, she'll just have no idea where that toy went. She'll look around and she'll just be so confused that the toy is suddenly missing. That is a lack of object permanence. And it's showing that, at least in that one particular domain, she's not able to develop past the cognitive level of a toddler. That being said, she is really smart, and I don't want to insult her intelligence. I know she's around somewhere. Babies in this stage really become little scientists. Things like shaking their rattles or pressing buttons on their toys just let them learn that, hey, if I do something, something else is going to happen in response. All of that is similar to the epistemological theory of empiricism. It's just cause and effect testing. The next stage that Piaget described was the pre-operational stage. And in this stage, it's largely characterized by the development of symbolic thinking. Children are able to look at the world and see things and understand that not everything is exactly as it appears. They are able to play in ways where they can make up games and pretend. You can hold a stick and think, yes, this is a sword, and they can fight like that, even though it's not. But the stick becomes a symbol for the sword. Now, their ability to actually understand symbols is still limited. One, they are unable to maintain certain concepts in their head. One way that Piaget tested this was he would take water in a glass and pour it into 2 different shaped glasses. Now, the glasses all filled the same amount of water up, but because of their shape, some would look much more filled than others. When he would test children at this stage of development, they would be unable to recognize that the water amount had not changed. They would think that the glass that looked more full had more water in it, despite the fact that it was just a change in shape that led to a different appearance of the water. The next stage of development, the concrete operational stage, typically lasts from around 7 to 11 years old. And at this stage, a child's logical thinking skills really start to develop, but that logic really only applies to concrete, tangible things in the real world. So if you were to take 2 chocolate bars and break one in half and one into quarters, at this stage, children are able to recognize, hey, even though one piece looks a lot bigger than the other, technically they're both the same amount of chocolate. This stage is marked by a development in inductive logic, the ability to reason from information and understand a general principle from that example. However, their abstract hypothetical thinking is still not fully developed. That comes during the formal operational stage, which is around 12 and up. At this place, children can not just think with inductive logic, but they can think deductively. They can get evidence and figure out reason from it. It's almost like being a little lawyer. Things like being able to plan for the future and think ahead of time instead of just reacting in the moment. Understanding abstract concepts like ethics, politics, morality, things that sure maybe aren't what children commonly think about, but they weren't able to even grasp these concepts at all prior to this stage of development. Piaget's theories were really instrumental in understanding some of the basic limitations that children have at various stages. And understanding these limitations is a key part of developmental psychology. And developmental psychology doesn't just focus on children. In fact, a lot of it is done on older adults. Back when I was an undergraduate, I worked in a lab where we studied attention and memory in older adults. In one study, we took both older and younger participants and had them read some material that they were going to be quizzed on later. And throughout it, they would get distracted by various information, just different stuff that wasn't relevant to what they were going to be tested on. And we found that both older and younger adults did pick up not just the relevant information, but they picked up the distracting information as well. However, what was interesting was that the way in which they processed the distracting information was different between the two age groups. While both groups remembered distracting information, older adults actually processed it at a deeper level. And what do I mean by deeper? Their attention was more focused on everything they were consuming to a point where they could remember very specific details about the distracting information, whereas the younger adults only had a surface level memory of the distracting info. That's just one example of many in which cognition and attentional resources change over the course of a lifetime. A consistent struggle within the research on developmental psychology is being able to parse apart where nature and where nurture play their respective roles. For example, in another study that I conducted a few years ago, we took a look at adolescent girls who were considered at risk for depression, and that's based off of their mother's history of depression. Basically, if their mom had experienced depression, the girls were more at risk for developing depression themselves. We found that for the girls who were more at risk for depression due to family history, they exhibited less activity in certain regions of the brain that process positive emotion. Now, while that finding is interesting of its own rights, there's really no way for sure of knowing, well, is it the at-risk girls had a genetic predisposition because of their mother's history? Or is it something about the environment they grew up in? Maybe having a mom experiencing depression made things more difficult. There's not a clear answer for that. And that is a question that developmental psychology is always trying to answer. Okay, next I want to talk about social psychology, which is one of the biggest and broadest fields within psychology, because this is looking at how people think, feel, and behave, but specifically in social contexts. How do we act around other people? How does being in a group change our behavior? There's so much in it regarding social interactions, group behavior, perceptions of others, how people conform, how people lead, what aggression is like between groups, how there's kindness and altruism between people, as well as concepts like prejudice and racism and sexism and all of these things that plague humanity. Social psych is really trying to understand how we both influence and are influenced by others, and understanding those underlying mechanisms that drive behaviors. These insights are critical for being able to address really any social issue, to improve communication, and to just create better relationships on both an individual and a societal scale. One of the key studies within social psychology was developed in the wake of the Second World War. Psychologist Stanley Milgram was curious how so many people went along with the atrocities seen in the Holocaust. Milgram wondered if people were just willing to listen to authority blindly, and that is how so many people allowed such cruel things to happen. To test these ideas, Milgram designed a series of studies that remain both highly influential and highly infamous to this day. Milgram brought participants in and told them that they were going to be doing a test with one other individual. Now, this other individual was not a true participant. They're what we call a confederate, which is a fancy word of saying someone who's actually in on the experiment. Now, these confederates were just research assistants in his lab. For this experiment, the true participants were told that both them and the other participant were going to be assigned the role of either the teacher or the learner. The teacher had to tell the learner a series of words, and the learner would have to repeat them back, which would get progressively more difficult as the task went on. Now, despite the participants being told assignment would be random, the true participant was always made to be the teacher. So the two were separated, and the teacher would go into a room and the learner would go into the next door room. Now, they were instructed to guide the learner on this task. They were told if the learner made any mistakes during this recognition task, that they would have to administer a punishment. They were told that this punishment was going to be an electrical shock delivered to the learner. This shock was going to be administered by the teacher. So the actual participant would press a button, and to their knowledge, they were causing electrical shocks to another human being. Now, as the experiment went on, there was actually no one getting shocked. The learner, or the Confederates, wasn't actually hooked up to anything. However, they had previously recorded a number of audio recordings of them screaming in pain. And anytime they would get the answer wrong and the shock would be administered, the learner would press the button and audio of them screaming in pain would play. Now, the teachers were all people, and people typically don't like hurting others just for the sake of it. And a lot of them would exhibit a lot of hesitation and say, hey, I don't want to keep doing this. This is wrong. I'm actually hurting somebody right now. And here's where Milgram's true study part came in. He would have his research assistants come in, and they would be wearing white lab coats. And they would tell the participant things like, please continue, the experiment must go on. And more often than not, the participant was willing to continue to administer these shocks. Milgram thought that by just putting on a white lab coat, creating that aura of authority would make someone do things that they wouldn't normally do. And actually, a majority of those participants would continuously increase the shock voltage to a point where the actual board where they were pressing would say they were hitting lethal levels of electricity. Many of these participants left very, very upset, and they were only told after the fact what had happened. Now, this study was critical in our understanding of the psychology of obedience and of listening to authority, even at the cost and detriment of others. Now, it is a very, very tricky study because of the ethical implications. You're making someone believe that they are truly hurting another person. That's not a good feeling. And it's for that reason that social psychology, in addition to all fields, but I would say particularly social psychology, really has to consider the ethics of their experiments. Another key theory within social psychology is the idea of our social identities. How do we know who we are when we're out in the world? Sure, maybe you know who you are with yourself, but sometimes we're not always acting in the same ways when we're around groups of people. Well, in the 1970s, psychologists Henry Tajfel and John Turner developed a theory that says that individuals derive their sense of identity and even their self-esteem from being members of social groups. According to this theory, people categorize themselves and others into groups. So that could be a group based off of your nationality, off of your race, off of your religion, your socioeconomic status, what school you go to, what sports team you support. There's really no end to group formation. But a key part of this is that people will favor the group that they belong to. They're going to prefer those people. They're going to think more highly of them. They're going to give them more grace when they make mistakes. And at the same time, they're going to discriminate against people that are outside of their own group. There's often negatively held attitudes towards people that don't belong to you. And you can see this play out all throughout history. One of the most common ways in which it plays out is the idea of racism. Being so supportive of your own race and exhibiting targeted nastiness, for lack of a better term, towards other races. Social psychology tries to understand what's the motivation for that. Why are people so held to these beliefs? Well, having an identity is a crucial part of our development. And even if it's at the detriment of others, people will crave that sense of identity. And group membership is a almost guaranteed way to feel some sort of identity. Throughout the course of the semester, of course, we're going to talk about all of these topics a lot, but I am particularly interested in talking about social psychology with y'all, just because it does explain so much of the behavior that we see in the world that creates problems. While still thinking about the concept of identity, let's pivot into personality psychology, which tries to focus on understanding individual differences between people. Sure, there's patterns of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings across people, but there's also some things that make us unique and some things that are special to us and different from other people. Well, our personality really shapes our experiences, our ways of seeing the world. They're basically our goggles that we wear at all times that will shape how we see things. Understanding personality helps us understand what drives people. And I mean on an individual level. Why am I behaving the way I behave versus why are you behaving the way you do? Why do I think the things I think and why do you think the things that you think? For this section, I'm going to talk about two major theories of personality, one more current and one more historic. I'll start off with the current one. The Big Five personality traits, also known as the five-factor model, is one of the most widely known and accepted frameworks for understanding personality. It was developed by psychologists Robert McCrae and Paul Costa in the 90s, and it identifies five broad dimensions of personality that are believed to capture some of the most variation in human personality. These five traits are conscientiousness, openness to experience, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional instability, also known as neuroticism. Broadly speaking, conscientiousness refers to a person's level of organization, dependability, and self-discipline. High levels of conscientiousness are associated with being really goal-oriented, really structured. Maybe it's making a schedule for yourself and writing down every single appointment. Whereas low conscientiousness is kind of the opposite. There's a lot of spontaneity. There's a lack of detail-oriented nature. It's someone who just rolls out of bed and realizes, oh, shoot, class is in 2 minutes. Hello, me. Um, Openness to experience is a trait that reflects someone's curiosity, creativity, and how much they're just willing to engage in new things. High openness looks like imagination, adventurousness, and just generally wanting to know things that maybe don't match with your worldview. Whereas low openness tends to prefer routine and structure and a lot of conventionality and just tradition. In this framework, extroversion refers to how social a person is, how assertive they are, how friendly they are in different situations. How in this framework, extroversion refers to a person's level of sociability, how much energy they bring to things, and how assertive they are. In this case, extroverts are outgoing, enthusiastic, and typically energized by social interactions, whereas the opposite end, introverts, are tend to be more reserved, more quiet, and more focused on solitary activities. Now, agreeableness refers to a person's tendency to be compassionate, cooperative, and trusting. So, high agreeableness looks like highly empathic nature, being kind and supportive, whereas low agreeableness might be more competitive, could be more critical, and on a whereas low agreeableness might be more competitive, critical, and even it's antagonistic. Finally, emotional instability or neuroticism is a tendency to experience negative emotions such as anxiety, anger, depression. High neuroticism typically looks like widely fluctuating emotions and high sensitivity to stress, so just getting stressed out really easily. Whereas low neuroticism might look more like being able to withstand negative emotional states. Now, depending on who you ask, all of these traits could be depending on who you ask, all of these traits can be broken down into sub-levels. So, one of the first levels is called aspects. For each of those five, it breaks down into two aspects. So, for openness to experience, that can be broken down into intellectual openness, how much you're interested in abstract ideas and intellectual pursuits. It's not just raw intelligence, being able to crunch numbers or anything like that. It's more so a curiosity for knowledge and a preference for complexity. You can almost think of it like, do you like solving complicated puzzles or not? There's nothing right or wrong about either way. They're just different personality traits. Another aspect of openness is appreciation for art, emotion, adventure, and just new experiences. Conscientiousness can be broken down into industriousness, how much someone is disciplined, efficient, and systematic in how they approach tasks. It's a lot of goal-directed behavior and persistence. Another facet, sorry, Another aspect of conscientiousness is orderliness. How organized are you? How much do you follow routine? And how detail-oriented are you? Extroversion gets broken down into enthusiasm, which relates to sociability and positive emotions like being cheerful, getting pleasure out of social interactions. But there's also assertiveness. How socially dominant are you? How much of a leader are you in situations? How strongly do you want to influence others? Agreeableness gets broken down into both compassion, which is like an empathic care for others, and politeness. How, and politeness, how respectful are you? How considerate are you of others? Finally, neuroticism gets broken down into volatility, which is looking at negative emotions like anger and mood swings. It also gets looked at as withdrawal, which is depression, anxiety, shyness. In addition to the two aspects per trait, there's also facets, which break it down to an even further degree. I'm not going to go through all of them here because we'll talk about it throughout the class. But for example, conscientiousness gets broken down into self-efficacy, how much you believe you can achieve things, orderliness, your preference for organization, routine, and schedules, dutifulness, your sense of duty and obligation, achievement striving, the desire to work hard and achieve goals, self-discipline, the ability to start tasks and follow them through, self-discipline, the ability to start a task and follow it through to completion, and cautiousness, how much you think through possibilities before you actually start on something. Now, an older theory of personality comes from Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. In his 1921 book, Psychological Types, Jung described different domains in which people can act. He identified 4 different axes, the first one being extroversion versus introversion. And in this case, it's not really about sociability. Extroversion looks at how much are you paying attention to the outside world? Do you care more about the objective data that you get from the world? Whereas on the other hand, introversion is how much are you focused on your own subjective understanding of things? Sure, you see something out in the world, but what you're doing predominantly is looking at how do you interpret it. Jung also talked about the difference between sensation and intuition. Sensation focuses on information that you've gathered from your 5 senses. What can you actually literally gather from the world? Whether that be things that you see, things that you hear, anything like that. Whereas intuition is more a focus on pattern recognition. It is developing relationships between those things that your senses have gathered. Jung also talked about thinking versus feeling, which isn't really just logic and emotion, but thinking looks more at testing theories. It's developing hypotheses, and it's trying to understand what is the best logical flow of information here. On the other hand, feeling refers to a preference for value systems. It looks more at morality for making decisions. Finally, there's the difference between judging and perceiving, whereas judging is focused more on structure, organization, and planning, whereas perceiving emphasizes flexibility and spontaneity. Now, these different personality traits described by Jung have a lot of overlap with the Big Five. And these traits often get used in personality assessments like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is typically used in personal development, career counseling, team building, etc. Different facets of personality can explain a lot about our behavior in different settings. However, it's important to note that just because a person might exhibit some behavioral traits doesn't mean that they are absolutely defined by them. I might say that I'm an introvert, but that doesn't mean I can't also be social within the Big Five framework. And it doesn't mean I can't be focused on objective data within the Jungian framework. Next, I want to touch briefly on educational psychology, which focuses on understanding how people learn and what are the best practices for teaching. So this is really a studying of how teachers teach and how students learn. It blends a lot of cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology, and more. It's really focused on understanding how educators can enhance their teaching methods, improve student outcomes, and address difficulties with learning. Not every student learns the same way, and educational psychology tries to both understand what is best for broad, typical learning and what is going to be most useful for individual basis learning. Some of the earliest theories in educational psychology come from just understanding how we learn. Edward Thorndike was an American psychologist in the late 1800s to early 1900s who was interested in studying how we learn. In some of his work, Thorndike created boxes which were basically puzzles. In some of his most important work, Thorndike created what are basically mini escape rooms for cats. They were boxes with only one way out. And he would place the cats in there and try and see how long it would take them to get out of the box. At first, the cats were just trying anything to get out. They would do random things. They would sometimes not even try at all. Eventually, they started to learn that if they pressed a specific lever within the box, they would get out and they would be rewarded with a treat. He found that the more that the cats were rewarded, the more they would learn how to get out of the box. And over time, that association between pressing the lever, escape, and treat led to solid learning, to where time could pass and the cats would still know how to get out of the box. Here we have an example of comparative psychology, because we're using a study of animal behavior to understand something on humans. Because that principle, learn something and get a reward, and it sticks with you, is something that works in people. That has been applied in educational psychology for years. It's honestly, at this point, almost common knowledge that if you want students to learn something, you have to actually do something that makes them enjoy it. They have to actually like what they're hearing. If you're just teaching someone and just droning on and on, being boring, maybe what I'm doing here, it's really hard for that information to be retained. This has led to a lot of influential theories on how to best educate students. Students get praised for getting correct answers. If someone's right, you don't want to say, that was stupid. That just wouldn't make sense. You're trying to get them to continue to say the right answer. Another important theory within educational psychology came from Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky studied children and understood, hey, there's some things that kids can do completely on their own. There's some problems that they can solve. There's also problems that no matter what you do, they're just not currently equipped to be able to answer those questions. However, he found an in-between region where maybe the kid could do these things, but with proper guidance. That area is now known as the zone of proximal development. It's the space in between what a learner is capable of doing without help and what a learner is capable of doing with help. A large focus within educational psychology is expanding not just what students can do, but also what they can do with teachers' help and support. When you combine Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development with Jean Piaget's stages of cognitive development, we have what's called constructivist learning theory, which says that learners are actively constructing or building their own understanding and knowledge of the world through their experiences, reflecting on those experiences, and through the aid of others, specifically those that are older and more experienced than them. The last subject I'd like to talk about here is health psychology, which focuses on how psychological, behavioral, and social factors influence our physical health and our well-being. It looks to see how things like our psychology and our behaviors contribute to our health, our illness, and the ways in which people respond to illness. As treating illness and disease is a vital part of staying alive, well, naturally, psychologists are going to be interested in how do we treat illness and how do we handle it. In the modern world, human lifespan has expanded long past what it used to be, whereas people used to be dying at age 30, 40 pretty regularly across the whole world. A large section of the world has increased human lifespan up to 80, 90, even 100 years. Because of that, chronic illnesses like heart disease, diabetes, and cancer have become more prevalent. And that's just because we're living longer. So, understanding how we can handle things like this from a psychological standpoint becomes an important question within treating diseases and illnesses themselves. For most of human history, medicine was approached from a purely biomedical perspective. Understanding how the body worked was how medicine worked. Well, in 1977, psychologist George Engel proposed what he called the biopsychosocial model of health. Now, this model was a significant departure from the traditional biomedical model because instead of just looking at biological factors, suddenly we're including psychological factors and social factors as well. This interaction between the biological, the psychological, and the social really provide a more holistic understanding of human health. One of the most prominent models within health psychology is known as the health belief model, which is basically looking at how people think about health, basically in a pro and con way. What are the benefits of taking action, or what are the drawbacks of it? What do you believe about your health conditions that are going to lead you to either go to the doctor or ignore a problem? If a person believes they're more at risk for a condition, they might be more likely to take not just responsive action, but preventative action. If you know that you have a condition, for example, many people who have family members with a history of drug addiction will actually report just not using drugs at all. Not because they're not interested, but because they know that they are at a higher risk factor for developing an addiction themselves. How much someone thinks that they're actually going to benefit from going to the doctor is going to affect their behavior. If they have a history of not trusting doctors, well, why would they go back? If doctors have not historically been good to you or even your community, what reason do you have to trust them? If you have issues with actually getting to the doctor, maybe it's too expensive. Maybe your community just typically doesn't go to the doctor. Well, these are all factors that are going to play into explaining what's going to drive a person to act or not act regarding their health. Health psychology often gets used to create behavioral interventions. These are things like programs to get people to stop smoking or exercise more. They try and understand what keeps people doing negative health behaviors and what prevents them from doing positive health behaviors. The development of public health campaigns, stress management programs, educational and support groups, these are all factors that have come out of health psychology. Well, that's it for today's video. We covered a few different topics that looked at how people act out in the world. Thanks for listening, everybody.